before you embarked on a sentence. I believe, gentlemen, he said, that Her Majesty is about to reveal the identity of the spy who has been battening on Project Isle. The silence lasted no more than 3 seconds. Dr. Gamble didn't even make a gesture during that time. Then Burris spoke. "Let's go," he snapped. He wheeled and headed for the door. The others promptly followed. "Gentlemen," Malone said, sounding, as far as he could tell, properly shocked and offended. "Your dress." "What?" Dr. Gamble said, throwing up both hands. "Oh, no," Boyd chimed in. "Not now." Burris simply said, "You're quite right. Get dressed, Boyd. I mean, of course, Sir Thomas." While they were dressing, Malone put in a call to Dr. O'Connor's office. The scientist was as frosty as ever. "Yes, Mr. Malone." The sound of that voice, Malone reflected, was enough to give anybody double revolving pneumonia with knobs on. "Dr. O'Connor," he said, "Her Majesty wants you in her court in 10 minutes, and in full court dress." O'Connor merely sighed, like Boreas. "What is this?" he asked. "More tomfoolery?" "I really couldn't say," Malone told him coyly. "But I'd advise you to be there. It might interest you." "Interest me?" Dr. O'Connor stormed. "I've got work to do here. Important work. You simply do not realize, Mr. Malone." "Whatever I realize," Malone cut in, feeling brave, "I'm passing on orders from Her Majesty." "That insane woman," O'Connor stated flatly, "is not going to order me about. Good Lord, do you know what you're saying?" Malone nodded. "I certainly do," he said cheerfully. "If you'd rather, I can have the orders backed up by the United States government. But that won't be necessary, will it?" "The United States government," O'Connor said, thawing perceptibly about the edges, "ought to allow a man to do his proper work, and not force him to go chasing off after the latest whims of some insane old lady." "You will be there now, won't you?" Malone asked. His own voice reminded him of something, and in a second he had it. The cooing, gentle persuasion of Dr. Andrew Blake of Rice Pavilion, who had locked Malone in a padded cell. It was the voice of a man talking to a mental case. It sounded remarkably apt. Dr. O'Connor went slightly purple, but controlled himself magnificently. "I'll be there," he said. "Good," Malone told him, and snapped the phone off. Then he put in a second call to the psychiatrists from St. Elizabeth's and told them the same thing. More used to the strange demands of neurotic and psychotic patients, they were readier to comply. Everyone, Malone realized with satisfaction, was now assembling. Burris and the others were ready to go, sparklingly dressed and looking impatient. Malone put down the phone and took one great breath of relief. Then, beaming, he led the others out. 10 minutes later, there were 9 men in Elizabethan costume standing outside the room which had been designated as the Queen's Court. Dr. Gamble's costume did not quite fit him. His sleeve ruffs were halfway up to his elbows, and his doublet had an unfortunate tendency to creep. The St. Elizabeth's men, all 4 of them, looked just a little like moth-eaten versions of old silent pictures. Malone looked them over with a somewhat sardonic eye. Not only did he have the answer to the whole problem that had been plaguing them, but his costume was a stunning, perfect fit. "Now, I want you men to let me handle this," Malone said. "I know just what I want to say, and I think I can get the information without too much trouble." One of the psychiatrists spoke up. "I trust you won't disturb the patient, Mr. Malone," he said. "Sir Kenneth," Malone snapped. The psychiatrist looked both abashed and worried. "I'm sorry," he said doubtfully. Malone nodded. "That's all right," he said. "I'll try not to disturb Her Majesty unduly." The psychiatrists conferred. When they came out of the huddle, one of them, Malone was never able to tell them apart, said, "Very well, we'll let you handle it, but we will be forced to interfere if we feel you're, going too far." Malone said, "That's fair enough, gentlemen. Let's go." He opened the door. It was a magnificent room. The whole place had been done over in plastic and synthetic fibers to look like something out of the 16th century. It was as garish and as perfect as a Hollywood movie set, which wasn't surprising, since 2 stage designers had been hired away from color TV spectaculars to set it up. At the far end of the room, past the rich hangings and the flaming chandeliers, was a great throne, and on it Her Majesty was seated. Lady Barbara reclined on the steps at her feet. Malone saw the expression on Her Majesty's face. He wanted to talk to Barbara, but there wasn't time. Later, there might be. Now he collected his mind and drove one thought at the Queen, one single powerful thought. "Read me. You know by this time that I have the truth, but read deeper." The expression on her face changed suddenly. She was smiling a sad, gentle little smile. Lady Barbara, who had looked up at the approach of Sir Kenneth and his entourage, relaxed again, but her eyes remained on Malone. "You may approach, my lords," said the Queen. Sir Kenneth led the procession, with Sir Thomas and Sir Andrew close behind him. O'Connor and Gamble came next, and bringing up the rear were the 4 psychiatrists. They strode slowly along the red carpet that stretched from the door to the foot of the throne. They came to a halt a few feet from the steps leading up to the throne, and bowed in unison. "You may explain, Sir Kenneth," Her Majesty said. "Your Majesty understands the conditions?" Malone asked. "Perfectly," said the Queen. "Proceed." Now the expression on Barbara's face changed to wonder and a kind of fright. Malone didn't look at her. Instead, he turned to Dr. O'Connor. "Dr. O'Connor, what are your plans for the telepaths who have been brought here?" He shot the question out quickly, and O'Connor was caught off balance. "Well, we would like their cooperation in further research which we, plan to do into the actual mechanisms of telepathy, provided, of course," he coughed gently, "provided that they become, accessible. Of course, Her Majesty has already been a great deal of help." He gave Malone an odd look. It seemed to say, "What's coming next?" Malone simply gave him a nod and a "Thank you, Doctor," and turned to Burris. He could feel Barbara's eyes on him, but he went on with his prepared questions. "Chief," he said, "what about you? After we nail our spy, what happens? To Her Majesty, I mean. You don't intend to stop giving her the homage due her, do you?" Burris stared, open-mouthed. After a second, he managed to say, "Why, no, of course not, Sir Kenneth. That is..." And he glanced over at the psychiatrists. "If the doctors think..." There was another hurried consultation. The 4 psychiatrists came out of it with a somewhat shaky statement to the effect that treatments which had been proven to have some therapeutic value ought not to be discontinued, although, of course, there was always the chance that... "Thank you, gentlemen," Malone said smoothly. He could see that they were nervous, and no wonder. He could imagine how difficult it was for a psychiatrist to talk about a patient in her presence. But they'd already realized that it didn't make any difference. Their thoughts were an open book anyway. Lady Barbara said, Ken, Are you going to